Middleton, who's going to welcome us to country here today. So come on up, Gavin.
Okay. Hopefully everyone can hear me from back there. Yep. So firstly, I just want to acknowledge our elders, past and present, for they are the traditional owners, and it's important to pay that respect first to them, but also to our neighbouring traditional owner groups of the Smithfield, Cairns region. I'd like to acknowledge our southern neighbours, Yirinji people, Gungandji people to the south, and the Yarrabah region to the west, Jabagai speaking people, Bulawai, and to the north, Gugi Yalanji people. And behalf of my people, my family, I would like to formally greet everyone on our traditional lands here within a JCU area. I'd like to say Nyurmajiri, Nyurmagaran, Gulmul Manganjan Baman, Bam Yirganji, Bam Jabagai, Nganjagurugura, Jipanji, Nganjambama Pulpo, Munaguri Janan, Yorumbang Gulungarango, and Guri Alaguli, Guri Puka, and Ngandamayan, and Yorumba, and Yanan Gaban, Bolumba, and Ngawongo, Yorumba, Karungandalna. Basically, I've said, wish you all in good spirits while you're here, and ancestors are all happy and proud for everyone gathering here today. And also just acknowledging what I've just said before, all our ancestors and old people. But also as part of that, I just want to put forward some of our cultural values within wetlands. So I think, you know, we still have our traditional cultural values for these different ecosystems. And for this particular event, Bulumba Jungle, which is our name for the wetland. And this covers many different little ecosystems within the wetland. We've got Jiragal, which is our mangroves, and really just tells the importance to our culture, our beliefs. I'll speak a bit about it later, but within this area here being part of the Barron River catchment, the Lower Barron has been very significant to Yirrakenji people, to Jabagai speaking people. We know that the river extends all the way up to the tableland, and there are a number of different tribes along this riverway. And being a bit of a footprint here of the Barron catchment, extending from Trinity Park, or Half Moon, all the way to the Cairns Airport area. And you know, through our creation stories with the land being formed, being created, a lot of these wetlands created from the Barron River. And I'm sure across Australia, across North Queensland, a lot of traditional owner groups will have this kind of relationship through their storylines, which really tell the importance of these wetlands and the reason and the really importance why we've got to look after it for the future. It's much bigger than we think, and it's great that we can sit here and talk about how important they are to everyone across North Queensland. So, thank you.
Thanks, Gavin, and yeah, really excited to have some of that traditional knowledge shared with us today. I think every step along this journey, we're learning more and more about how important traditional management is, and how we can all learn a bit from that relationship to country in our Whitefellow ways too. So before the break tonight, we're going to hear a little bit from Dennis in a moment, and then we're going to have Nathan Waltham, who's going to be talking about restoring natural wetlands in the GBR area. And after that, Rob Coles is going to be talking about the Queensland Seagrass Meadows. And then after the break, we're going to hear from Gavin a little bit more about some of the knowledge he has to share. Dennis will be talking a bit about some of the local issues in our wetlands. And Lucy, our friend, will be finishing up talking about a really exciting new element that's up and coming around blue carbon and the role that wetlands play there. And then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So hopefully you can keep writing your questions down tonight. We will take some, maybe one from the Zoom room and one from this room at the end of the speakers before the break. But if we don't get to your question, make sure you write it down, because there's going to be a Q&A panel, and we'll have Liz Owens and Dennis Arkey from Jarragan's down in the Mulgrave area, also sharing with us, and they're doing some amazing wetlands work down there too, so a really exciting lineup. Dennis is going to introduce a little bit more about Ramsar Wetlands and then pass on to Nathan, so enjoy.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Lucy is a director of CAFNIC and I'm the president. And thanks also to Bill for having us here tonight on behalf of TESS. We must accept the kindness you've offered us being here in this mini symposium event. Ramsar, a few people have said to me, what is Ramsar? Well, Ramsar is a little town, only about 25,000 people in northern Iran, next to the Caspian Sea. And on the 2nd of February 1971, the Ramsar Convention, as it's now called, was established to create security for wetlands around the world. Now, at the moment, it's estimated there are 2,500 roughly wetlands sites in the Ramsar listing around the world. That's phenomenal, which is around 250,000 hectares of land, which is in Ramsar listing, which is incredible. In Australia, we've got 65 sites, and we've got 5 in Queensland. The closest one to us here is south of Townsville, Bowling Green Bay. And then the one you probably know most about and you've been reading about in the papers is the one down off Brisbane in Moreton Bay, where the Toondah Harbour development is causing a lot of controversy around the impacts it could have on that Ramsar listing. So I won't say more about the Ramsar issue now because we must hasten on. And I know that Nathan also is going to say something a bit more about Ramsar in his talk. So please put your hands together and welcome Nathan to the podium. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. All right, glasses on. Okay, I'm assuming this is going through to Zoom, so we're okay? Yep. Thanks everyone for coming along tonight. Thanks, Bill, for the invitation to come along and present at TESS. Thanks, CAFNA, for the invitation to talk again tonight about wetlands. This stuff gets me so excited, so we're gonna go close to 30 minutes for me because I'll ramble on quite a lot. I'd like to thank a whole lot of end users that I'm working with, from NRM groups, NGO groups, Indigenous groups. Those guys are on the ground doing a lot of the work that I've been fortunate to partner with and do the science evaluation around. So really like to thank them for their efforts over the last sort of 5 or 6 years. So it means lots of cups of tea, but lots of information sharing, which has been really quite exciting to be part of that. And the Australian government has funded the work over the last 5 or 6 years too, which is good. Gavin's run off now, but he did mention in the Coral Reef Restoration, no, he's up the back. You did mention at the Coral Reef Restoration Symposium we had a couple of years ago here in Cairns, I think it was you that talked about the complexity and the diversity of ecosystems in our coastal zone, and it's going to take an ecosystem of people to solve these problems. And I thought, to me, that was a really powerful message, and one that still to this day, a few years on, still resonates quite well with me. The coastal zone, so this is that transition between the sea and land. There is a whole range of wetland habitats. So wetlands, as Dennis has mentioned, is basically anything that's wet out to 6 metres below sea level, so it does include coral, are considered to be wetlands under the definition in Ramsar. So there are multiple different habitats. They're freshwater, they're a bit salty, a bit more salty, getting into estuaries and marine habitats. So they're really complex. So when you start thinking about the seascape now, you need to really look at it from a very multidisciplinary and very, very complex approach. We've talked about definitions of wetlands. However, in the coastal zone, where most of these wetlands are, these coastal ecosystems, they support incredible biodiversity. They have important cultural values. I asked my daughter what she thinks of coastal wetlands, and she says that's where Nemo is. That's the important habitat that we need to think about. Mangrove Jack is a fish species that is incredibly interesting. It has a life cycle ecology that moves from freshwater habitats to estuaries to nearshore coral reefs to complete its life cycle. And then it moves back into freshwater again. So it requires that connectivity across all those different ecosystems, those wetland ecosystems, simply to complete its life cycle. Without that connection, the life cycle is broken. So the mangrove jack, it needs access across all those different wetland ecosystems to complete its life cycle. That message is a really powerful message to take to farmers. They get that. It's a currency they understand. Fish, they love going fishing on the weekends. And they understand then when you start talking about seascapes and connectivity. However, we humans like to modify the seascape. We get a lot of enjoyment, recreational activities. We love the seascape so much that we are actually modifying, increasing the amount of opportunities to have residential real estate right along the coastal zone. So you see these incredible artificial waterways being built to maximise the opportunities for waterfront development. So we love the seascape, but at the same time, we love the conservation, the biodiversity values it gives us. The Great Barrier Reef is right on our doorstep. We all know it. We've all dived there, I'm sure. It's got outstanding universal values. It has cultural significance, economic values, incredibly important. And not for 1 second am I suggesting we don't forget about that and manage that. But if we turn 180 degrees, we have these wonderful wetlands, these transitional areas within the coastal zone that we're modifying. And we've been doing that for a long time. The photo on the left there is from a major agricultural development project in the Tully. This is the SIPS program. Lots of money was invested to modify the landscape, drain wetlands, and get rid of the water, increase production. It's incredible to think that happened about 25 years ago. So we've lost lots of wetlands. That's the point of that story. We've also got a whole range of freshwater artificial wetlands that we've built as well. So these are where we've put earth walls up to stop the tide coming in, to create freshwater ponded pasture areas on the upstream side. So they're artificial. There's lots of those across the GBR landscape. And they provide important habitat for water birds. I know Simon up the back there would definitely agree with me there. So although they're artificial, they look bad, lots of weeds. They're actually the last remaining freshwater habitats we really have, although they are man-made. So my work has been across a whole range of different ecosystems, wetland ecosystems. It's been funded by the National Environmental Science Program, NESP. When I first started on this journey about 5 years ago, was overloaded by the number of restoration projects that were willing to partner with me as a science partnership, which was great. So to get through that, weed through that, I guess I focused on the types of wetland restoration projects that these end user groups were focused on. So up the top there, a bund wall removal project, which I'll talk a little bit more about. That was in Mangala. Jarragon had a constructed wetland there, so Liz and Dennis will talk about that a bit later. The Burdekin floodplain, a lot about fish connectivity, removing invasive freshwater plants and getting the connectivity for fish to move across the landscape. Feral pigs, big problem. In fact, I think we saw some evidence of feral pig damage on campus just a few minutes ago. So there's a project there we did, and I'll talk a bit more about that one. And then ponded pasture as well. We looked at another site. This is down Tedlands, which is about a 400 hectare freshwater wetland built about 20, 30 years ago. So I haven't got time to talk about all those projects, but I want to hit some of the key findings, I guess. These are really important lessons we've learned. So Mangala it's got a really rich and wonderful Depressing history as well. You think about the stolen generation. It touches Mangala. The earth wall was built in about 1940s. A long story I'll happy to tell you about all a bit later on, if you've got time, around moving a homestead across a floodplain. So the shortest route was to build an earth wall, stopping the tide getting in. That resulted in a freshwater habitat on the upstream side, which was once mangroves and salt marsh. Weeds came, environmental weeds, freshwater weeds, oxygen levels, water quality deteriorated, fish declined, bird species declined. So about 2010, Cyro and the Nawagi people got some money to the Australian government to remove a section of the bund wall and let the tide back in, rather than using aerial spraying chemicals to get rid of the freshwater plants. It was about using salt water to destroy and remove the plants, get that connectivity, improve water quality, and the fish would return. So that worked really well. 2012, can't believe I'm going to say this as an ecologist, but the dozer came in, it removed a section of the bund wall, and literally the tide overnight came in. And we've got the time series photos there showing that the tide came in, the freshwater weeds were destroyed, and it was looking really good. Caris was coming back full of freshwater species. Barramundi were being caught there. So it was a great story, those first few years. However, and this is one of my main points, is the funding ran out at that point. The story was great, success. Funding ran out. Fortunately, got a little bit more money to keep going with the monitoring. And we went through above average rainfall wet seasons. And the system there flipped to a dominated freshwater habitat again. So previously dry seasons, so failed wet seasons, the tide got in there maybe 6 or 7 times a year. We went into an above average rainfall period and the tide was getting in there 1 or 2 times a year. So the system went back to being freshwater, weeds, problem returned. And so very much so the hydrology is the point. You get the hydrology right, the ecology will follow. It's taken us about 8 years now to really understand that particular restoration site. And we may have actually had a conclusion after those first few years that was not quite right if the funding hadn't kept going. So short-term funding can be a problem. As part of the second work, we also looked at climate change. And so we ran some sea level rise scenarios, 50 centimetre, 80 centimetre tide increase, and about sort of 2021 sort of thing. We'll go from about 10 tides a year to sort of 15, 16 tides a year. We'll get in there. So this then starts to open up questions around blue carbon opportunities. Not now, but maybe in the future. Maybe mangroves might grow back there. I talked a little bit about feral pigs, and feral pigs are a big problem across Northern Australia, definitely. They get into wetlands. They're there to source food, usually targeting aquatic snails, turtles, freshwater turtles as well, some of the plant species. And it's really interesting, this is a project on Cape York where we were putting fences around wetlands to keep the pigs out as a way of trying to get the services and the function back into the wetlands. However, the local ranger there, not only proud of that large piggy shop, told me after that photo that he was reflecting on the fact that whilst we're removing the pigs from the landscape, it's also a source of protein for them. So they don't want to get rid of all the pigs. And so you have this really interesting services and value type debate you need to go through when you're setting up a restoration project. So some great photos before and after. Put a fence around the wetlands. It's pretty simple to do, not that expensive. You get some great photos, so your funding bodies like that. We dived into some of the sites, and there's 3 lines on this graph The A, which is the solid line, reflects the temperature distribution for a unfenced and pig impacted wetland. And so you can see there the temperature gets hotter basically. And B and C are that sort of the broken lines, and they are the persistent wetlands. So these are deep permanent water bodies that we have on the Arch River floodplain, and a fenced wetland, which is C. And you can see the temperature where we have a deep pool, persistent pool, or a wetland that's fenced with vegetation doesn't get as hot as a pig impacted wetland. Now that's important when you run some thermal tolerance tests on these individuals. These fish have an acute thermal tolerance at which they, beyond that temperature, there's a response, usually they'll die. That's their response. So any temperatures above that acute thermal threshold point means that the fish is in stress and looking for refugia. In a pig impacted wetland, they're having to engage that response. They need to look for thermal refugia somewhere in those wetlands. In the persistent wetlands, we don't reach that temperature. So there's a great incentive to protect our persistent wetlands in the landscape. And there's also an incentive to fence the wetlands. You protect the vegetation, it provides a thermal refugia, a thermal environment that the fish are quite comfortable with. So that was a really good outcome, a service outcome to managing the threat being the pigs. However, there are freshwater turtles in the landscape. Freshwater turtles have a life cycle ecology where they do need to move across the landscape. So if you have a wetland that's drying out in northern Queensland, let's say, they need to move, but if there's a fence there, they can't move. So all of a sudden there becomes this problem. So again, this idea of really identifying what is the value and what is the service that you are wanting to protect in your wetland, the wetland restoration project becomes really important. I want to talk a little bit about now some really exciting work that we've been doing. And this is a project I took on in 2016. I was told it was potentially a career limiting project. This idea of taking sugarcane out of production and turning it into some other land use that is a water quality benefit, but might actually provide an income source for farmers. So we looked at marginal cane lands. When you look on Google Earth, there's lots of areas that you can see pretty easily that are marginal. So the farmer is trying really hard to get some return on that property. Lots of fertilisers probably been applied, lots of fertilisers being lost, and very little return on that. So very, very expensive exercise. That site there is seawater coming in over that sort of 13 years or so. So the idea here is, could we actually identify areas that are marginal and look at what are the alternative land uses they could transition to? We did some economics around it, and wetlands, if you remove those marginal areas, those sugarcane areas, and turn them into a wetland that are providing water treatment, so a treatment wetland, the cost to do that can actually be very affordable for farmers. Something like about $20 per kilo DIN reduced for a farmer. $20 per kilo DIN reduced. That's what it will cost. If you can then incentivise that, and this is where it gets really exciting under this idea of reef credits, which people may have heard of. This is a funding market mechanism whereby companies want to offset or contribute to some sort of environmental dividend fund. So they'll pay for a water quality project, reef credits. If you can match that up to farmers that want to transition marginal cane out of production, you can all of a sudden achieve some fantastic water quality outcomes and also make that economically viable for farmers. And so we've done the maths, it'll work. Where it won't work is our milled operators. They have a very different view to mine. But I think there's ways around that. So Reef Credits is an exciting one. Another really interesting area, which we've just got one project up recently, is letting the tide back in and activating blue carbon or possibly biodiversity credits, cassowary credits, one of our projects is looking at. And so all of a sudden, by taking that marginal cane land out of production, you could activate these market mechanisms around carbon, water quality, biodiversity, and maybe you can bundle that together in your restoration projects. And so we're looking for those opportunities now. I won't talk about the history of restoration because I'm probably running out of time, but what I want to make the point is there's a line in the sand, which is this year, 2021. The UN declared last year that starting this year, in the next 10 years, is the decade on ecosystem restoration. It is the line in the sand, whereby moving forward, it's about restoring our ecosystems, our coastal ecosystems. So this is really exciting when you start thinking about market mechanisms. So what we might see, and what we are probably already seeing, and I think will only increase, is a lot more projects around restoration, oyster restoration. You may have read a little bit about that, heard about oyster restoration. Coral reef restoration, lots of excitement in that space. Salt marsh restoration, there's lots of work happening in that space. Mangroves, and Rob will talk about seagrass very soon. But I guess while there's all this excitement, and I'm equally excited as well, we can't take our eyes off the science and some of the paradigms that are in place around how effective some of these habitats are for production of fish, let's say. We need to be very careful about that. For example, there's papers that talk about the value of mangroves, and it's a hectare per hectare basis. But we know in tropical estuaries that it's only that mangrove edge that's actually effective for fish. So you can't actually make that link successfully. So we've got a paper on that we wrote recently. We did a review of all the wetland restoration projects that we could find, and there was about 250 that we found in the literature. Very interestingly, salt marsh is a very popular restoration project service that's being looked at very much so in the US. Lots of studies there. What was interesting in that review, and there's lots of other data behind that review, which we're writing up at the minute. The length of time it took, at least they reported in those studies, it took to achieve success. There's a whole nother lecture or discussion on what is actually successful. So I'll park that, but it takes a long time basically. And again, coming back to my funding point about Mangala taking a long time to understand that. It could take up to 20 years to get to a successful outcome. Moving forward, there's lots of excitement around digital technology. And I think if we can start linking these domains together in our restoration ecology, we can get some fantastic outcomes in terms of lots of information, accurate, safe, talking about wetlands and crocodiles. So lots of work's being done in this institute. There's a marine data hub, which is looking at artificial intelligence to identify and count fish in underwater videos. So that's progressing very fast. We have a really high-profile scientist who's got a DECRA, Nick Murray, in Townsville. He's mapping coastal ecosystems at the scale of the world. Amazing information that's coming from that Nick's working on. And looking at how those ecosystems change through time. And so that information coming out is just powerful, so incredible. I'm completely underselling the work that he's doing, but some fantastic stuff using satellites. So using data to answer questions and linking that to end user actionable knowledge, I think is where the future is heading towards with restoration work. The data collection side of things, I think we've got that pretty much under control. It's off the shelf, almost, some of that technology. It's using that to answer applied questions and linking that to end users is the really exciting area that we are certainly looking at very closely and working in. So the lessons learned, sort of in our group more broadly, I can add up about 35 years worth of work in the business, and the consensus, at least in our group, is that you know, we still have a lot we don't know about restoration. Restoration research, you know, takes 20 odd years before we can measure success. So, you know, it takes a long time to get there. Restoration, it's been reported in a number of articles that it's each experiment or each restoration project is an experiment in itself, which is really interesting. It's not something I've read in one paper, it's been written multiple times. And so that's very interesting when you think about a restoration project you might be involved with. Think about it in terms of an experimental design. Long-term data is important. I've also want to make a real strong point, I suppose, on that after your project's finished, you walk away, there's a maintenance phase. And more often than not, restoration projects fail because the funding finishes, they walk away, the weeds come back, and people get a bit unhappy about the success of that. So there needs to be a funding model in place to support that investment into the future. Publish the failures. There's still much we don't know about it, and working with community, I think, is really important, and I really can't say that any more strongly than some of the successful projects that we've had, and it's really been because of the hand-in-glove approach that we've had across our end users. That's time. There you go.
So also joining us from Tropwater is Rob Coles. Rob's going to be speaking to us about, and I'll let him get his slides ready, about Seagrass Meadows, which is another really important part of our wetland ecology in this area, and certainly some of the animals that we all love depend deeply on these rare environments. So really excited to hear from Rob and the Seagrass team, apparently. Please welcome Rob Coles.
Can you all hear me okay? Is it good enough? Good. So I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of our land before I start, and the elders past, present and future, on whose land, in my case, sea, we work and live and play. So today I'm going to be talking on behalf of the team. The work I'm producing isn't all mine. I'm just a hanger-on at times. My only real relationship to Ramsar is almost to the day 50 years ago I started at uni, so I've been around a long time. I've been around as long as Ramsar. And today's an omnibus talk. Not everyone here is a university person, so I'm going to stay a little bit high at times and a little bit low at times. When I show a complex slide, I'll put the papers that are attached to it. If you're a university person, James Cook's really good university library systems available to you. If you're an outsider and you want that information, there's my email address. You can email me and say, Rob, there was a slide there about connectivity. Can you send me a copy of the paper? And I can do that for you. So let's go. Today's talk then. I'm going to give you a quick lesson in tropical seagrass biology. I'm sure not all of you know your seagrass biology, so you won't get the full lecture here tonight, but you'll certainly get a bit of it. Why seagrass is important, a little bit about our monitoring history, something about our data and how you can look at it yourself, turtles and dugongs, and then if I get time, a bit about connectivity. But when I was putting this talk together, I was told not to be too scientific. I was told talks about seagrass, about grass growing can be a bit boring, so can you make it a little bit more exciting than normal? So I will, while I'm doing it, talk about why that young man who's now in charge of our group in Cairns was out on a mudflat on a motorbike. Why this young scientist, Samantha Toll, who's just received her doctorate, Dr. Samantha Toll, is doing something incredibly gross with things in the water and still smiling. And if you could remember, if you were there and could smell what that was like, you'd be even more surprised why that smile. So I will talk about this network analysis and why it looks like a Facebook friends grouping and why that's important and could save us money. And down on the bottom there, our friends in Central Queensland University have mocked up a Yates seagrass seed packet. So the dream was we could just send out a packet of seeds and you could restore seagrass. It is a dream, it's a joke, but it's there for you to think about. And I have to do this too because we're seagrass scientists and we live in a world where people think coral is really important. Coral really is important, but there's more seagrass meadows than coral in the Great Barrier Reef. I'm going to talk mostly about the Great Barrier Reef today. I will bring a little bit of Gulf in as well. But it's a huge ecosystem with about 35,000 square kilometres of seagrass habitat, potential habitat in the Great Barrier Reef, 17,000 square kilometres in the Torres Straits, and Gulf's a bit less. We've got 15 potential species. We normally use about 12 of them because there's a bit of concern about accuracy for the others. That's about 20% of the world's seagrass species, so huge. It goes in the Great Barrier Reef down to about 70 metres. I think 76 metres is the deepest we found seagrass, which is really a reflection of how good the water quality is in places. People are concerned about the water quality close in, but you go to the outer reef at days when it's no wind, and you don't need a camera to see the seagrass on the bottom. You can see down 50 metres into the bottom. So the seagrass will go right deep. It needs about 10% of ambient light to grow. So that shows you how clear the water is at times. It's not always there. Some species of seagrass are annuals. They're not there in winter time. They're only there through Christmas and the warm times of the year. People think that seagrasses should be there, but no, they come and go. Some species disappear and come back from seeds every year. So if you go there the wrong time, you'll get a bare bottom. The right time, you'll see a fabulous meadow. They're food for turtle and dugong, and recent studies have suggested around about 270 million tonnes of carbon alone in the deepwater seagrasses. The pictures down the bottom, though, tell you a story. So if you go from the far side, that's Green Island. People go to Green Island because they think they're visiting the coral of the Great Barrier Reef. No, you're not. You're visiting one of the best seagrass meadows you could possibly ever see. That's low tide at Green Island, just past the swimming zone. You should be able to find about 7 species there easily, more if you know what you're doing. So there's magic meadows just out here near Cairns. If you're a Townsville person, for those on Zoom, Maggie Island's pretty good as well, so is Paloranda. But most of the seagrass, like the middle picture there, is quite low in density. And I just showed you the other picture there on the far side. They're dugong feeding trails in a seagrass meadow in Harvey Bay down south. Now, I don't think most people would see that as a seagrass meadow, because when you say meadow, you kind of think of a paddock, a lucerne. But when you get into the seagrass world, that is an important seagrass meadow because the animals are feeding mostly in the root mat. If you look very closely, you can actually see freckles of leaves there. A lot of the seagrass is underground, which is a problem if you're using drones or satellites to monitor seagrass meadows because you may miss some of the seagrasses which are actually quite important and underground. So seagrasses are flowering plants. They have a true root system, they have roots, vascular system, probably related to lilies and gingers rather than the terrestrial grasses. And they need the classic things that flowering plants need. You have to have light, you have to have some sort of shelter, a substrate or so that they can live in. And they often mostly form that kind of standard pattern of having a rhizome, horizontal rhizome that stretches out, roots hanging down, leaf shoots standing up from it. If you look down the bottom, they do have not only the strap-like grass sort of seagrass, but also seagrasses with round leaves that's ovalus down the bottom. When you hear people talk about seagrass, they often say seagrass in the Great Barrier for doing this or doing that. I understand that these plants are quite different. They may all be called seagrasses, but ecologically they don't act the same way. The ones at the top, if you're a dugong and you come along and eat the green shoots, that plant can then grow more leaves from the same shoot. If you do that to the little round leaf ones down the bottom, they can't regrow those leaves. They're non-leaf replacing. They have to put out a runner, 2 new petioles, 2 new leaves and start again. So ecologically, they behave in quite different ways. There are what we call foundation species, the massive species, but some of them are also very small and quite quick to move. They'll recolonise very quickly. There is no such thing as a seagrass. There are a group of plants that behave in the water as marine plants, flowering plants. And they do flower and seed underwater. So if you look up the side, 2 seeds, you can see seeds on Sovidosa at the top, Uninervis at the bottom. I have some seeds in my wallet if you want to see them later. I've been through customs so many times with odd seeds in my pocket. One day they'll catch me. In the middle, they're female flowers of Halophila spinulosa at the top. Really beautiful, delicate stigmata there. You can see them. There are no hibiscuses underwater. There's no big red. If you like big red flowers and roses, you're not going to find them in the Seagrass Meadow. What you do find, though, is these really beautiful, delicate, small flowers that once you've seen one, you'll find them. Like, you just need to get the focal length right when you're in the water and you'll see them. They're not that uncommon. And to the right-hand side there, you can see a male flower of Valus letting out pollen into the water. The pollen goes into the water and is shifted around by water currents, or there could be some animal involvement too. And just to finish off, one species in Queensland has come to the surface to pollinate, and that's the big fruit there you can see. And it actually pollinates using small pollen sacs that keep the pollen dry. I won't go into evolutionary history at the moment, but you can see the white stuff in the water there. Looks like polystyrene foam. That's at Bali, so it's not actually pollution at all. It's seagrass pollen in the water, and sometimes it's enormous. It can cover the world. So they are important. Just like the grasslands in the terrestrial world, they're the primary producer. They're the things that get eaten by fish, prawns, turtles, dugong, and turned into food for the world. They act as a vast aquarium filter in the tropics. So everything you see in that picture that's green will be gone in 10 days. The leaf turnover rate's enormously high. People look out at the seagrass. We have these people who come to us and say, oh, you know, when I was a kid, the seagrass was knee deep and now it's all gone. The reason it's gone is because it's not static. It's turning over all the time. There's a huge amount of flux going on. The leaves are growing, they're being eaten, they're breaking off, washing away, or becoming carbon. About 15% just actually goes into carbon in the soil. So they're really quick and they act as an aquarium filter. They're sucking nutrients out of the water. And there's quite a bit of research around that shows that they improve the water quality and help reduce pathogens for coral. So actually are quite valuable for the coral. They stabilise sediments. I'll show you that in a minute. They store carbon, we know that. And they've generally looked after themselves in the Great Barrier Reef until recent times when we've had these big cyclones, and I'll deal with that in a second. So they're hugely productive. That's me at Marina Cove down in South Australia. That's 3 metres deep, that seagrass mass on the beach, which is just washed up. And it's 20 metres long. There's a massive amount of carbon produced by seagrass meadows. You don't see that in the tropics. The best I could find was a picture from Green Isle. That's there too. And it's just small. And it doesn't last long in the tropics. It's hot and it breaks down. You kick those wrap off the beach and you'll find lots of little animals living in it, eating it, amphipods and things. So it doesn't last. In the cold water of South Australia, it lasts a lot longer. And down the bottom there, just to show you what I said about sediment stabilization, which is actually from Port York in the Maldives, you can see how much of the seagrass is actually under the ground as opposed to being on the ground. When you look at a seagrass meadow, you're not looking at the whole plant, you're looking at what sticks up. Some species don't put many roots down. Other species, like Flasser in that picture, have a huge root mat under the water. So we have another, a scientist here who's been doing some work on grazing, Abby Scott, who's here. She's just received a PhD, so congratulations, Abby. Abby put cages out because we were interested to know just how much grazing was going on. We know from overseas studies that grazing can be quite destructive to seagrass if it's too much. So Abby put cages out, and you can see from the top 2 pictures that where they're protected from being grazed, you get quite a bit more growth. And down the bottom, this is the best we could do. I mean, it doesn't always work like this, but you can see the cage there where there's no seagrass outside and the seagrass is being left intact inside. That was an event where the turtles or dugong just came along and did a big eat outside the cage. But when you look at a seagrass meadow, when you measure the amount of biomass, when you take a photograph of it, remember that you're not taking a picture of something that's static. It's being eaten, it's growing, it's breaking off. You're looking at a flux issue, and at any one time, that can be hugely variable and not necessarily a bad thing. A small biomass seagrass meadow may in fact be a sign that the system's working well, not. It's a bit too easy to get in. The bigger is better. You know, it's a huge seagrass meadow, so it's really great. Well, not necessarily. Again, you can read the paper. I can't go into details today. But I'm just going to drop back then into our research history. I did promise to show you what the motorbike was all about. That was part of a series of learning from the early 80s. I mean, we started off by crawling in the mud. That's me. We did a lot of diving. A lot of the early sampling work was free diving and diving. We're doing less now. We did try motorbikes, and that's Dr. Michael Rashid. He's now in charge of the group in Cairns. So I think that was a turning point in my career. I sent him out there on a motorbike. We have used cameras, and you will see us using helicopters because helicopters are quite quick. And unlike a drone, they enable us to drop down and get a sample and actually work out what species we're looking at. So you'll see us wandering around Cairns and Townsville in a helicopter. At the top there, that's me in 1981 with Warren Long, one of the families in Cairns, you might know. And we were looking at prawns back then, funded by the fishing industry, and that led us to understand the value of seagrasses. The map is our first publication, and back in those days, you had to hand draw the map and stick things called letraset on it to show where the seagrass was, how things have changed in that time since 1981. But during that time, we've collected a whole lot of seagrass information, but it's been paid for by different people. So sometimes different purposes, different precisions, and different data at times. But we have now more than 81,000 records of when someone's been to the bottom and had a look this is just the Great Barrier Reef. We've got other places. And that's because we're very lucky. I'm still around from those days. We still have Jane Mellors in Townsville around from those days. Warren Long's around, and Lyle Squire Senior from Cairns Marine and his wife, Bev Squire, both worked with us, and we're still around. So we're able to go back to that very old data that was on paper sheets and re-enter it, check the species, make some decisions about it, create it if you like, and re-enter it. It's now on eAtlas. If you look at the website I've got down the bottom of that slide, you can go and have a look at that data. It's available in 3 forms. You can read our report down the bottom there and see what we think, or you can go into the actual database and there's an interactive web engine there you can use. You can click on each one of those 81,000 points and it'll tell you when we had a look at it and what was there in terms of species. So it's very valuable. That's available as a Creative Commons level 3, so you can use it. We'd like you to talk to us, so if you will. And I've just done a simple sort there, or Alex has done for me, showing you that we can then break that down to species, and you can see some species, inhalers in the middle is only in the north. Other species turn up everywhere in the Great Barrier Reef, including out way away from the shore. So you can start sorting that data and see where the seagrass is, and we can do those analysis. And we've been using that. So I don't know if anyone remembers the 2004 rezoning of the Great Barrier Reef, but in that process, we recognised 40 inter-reef bioregions on the information we had. We've gone back to have a look at that approach, and just looking at seagrass, and Alex and Kath Collier and I and Michael Rashid, we've looked at 6 models. We looked at estuarine intertidal, subtidal, reef intertidal, subtidal, and coastal subtidal and intertidal, and 10 environmental forcing factors, 12 species, presence of absence. And we used a machine learning process, random forest, non-parametric, and we separated the reef seagrasses out into what we saw as 36 different communities. The message I want you to take away from this is when people tell you that the Great Barrier Reef seagrasses are doing something, that's a combined message of understanding. Reality is there's 36 different habitat types all doing different things. Some of them we know a lot about. There's about 24, 25 of those communities we have reasonable data for. The rest we don't have good data, and that includes the big green areas there in Deepwater. We have very little ongoing monitoring on Deepwater seagrasses, and unfortunately in Queensland, little monitoring from estuaries either. So we're able to look at where we're data deficient, and we're now going to overlay that with protections to see which of those types of communities are in need of better protection. But it also shows you up straight away that there's substructuring in the Great Barrier Reef. You'll see that area down near Mackay, down the bottom. There's not a lot of seagrass. That's the big tide country where the water sweeps in and out. You'll also notice in the wet tropics, you get these bands of communities. So the reef doesn't act as one at all. It acts as a series of subsets. Cyclone Yasi then. So we have that data to look at, but Cyclone Yasi was a wake-up call for us in that until then we hadn't really thought too much about the problem of losing seagrass without warning. But Cyclone Yasi, and those pictures were taken about a month after the cyclone. We had enormous trouble getting a window to get a plane in the air, a helicopter in the air. And even then you can see that was marginal flying weather. We surveyed Townsville to Cairns and we found about 3 seagrass plants from the 6,000 hectares that should have been there. Sorry, 3,000 hectares that should have been there. The environment, you can see after a cyclone, it's not just the windy bit that's the problem. The environment that was left behind with logs rolling around in the shallow water, lots of sediment being resuspended, it's absolutely toxic to seagrass. There's no way you're going to get a seagrass meadow regrowing while it's like that. And if you look carefully at the oyster blocks on that jetty, this is cardboard, you'll notice they're now way out of the water. The cyclone scoured the sediment away and changed the topography. There's no point talking about restoring seagrass in the days after a cyclone. It's just not going to work. So we don't have long-term data there from Carvel, although I might add, if you go to Carvel now at low tide and sit at the BP service station or walk out on the jetty, there's a beautiful seagrass meadow come back, and there's dugong feeding trails there. You can see that without going anywhere. But we do have good annual data from Cairns. So I've just showed you the Cairns work, Sky McKenna's work. So in the graph there, green's good, red's bad. That's area, and you can see around 2007 it was doing really well in Cairns. Then we had Yassi, Larry, La Nina, we had Tasha, might have had Hamish there, I can't remember them all, but we had a series of really, really wet years, and the seagrass crashed, and you can see the pictures there. It was really good, and it disappeared entirely, and it came back slowly after about 3 years, and then it came back quite well. We think it came back from seeds in Cairns Harbour. We were about to say we need to do something when it started to recover, because seeds don't last that long in the mud, but it suddenly came back. That gives you some idea of the kind of cycle you get after a cyclone. It's probably the actual environment has to settle down before you get seagrass back. Once the environment settles back, it starts to come back. We also did some fish work before and after, and you can see that while there was seagrass there were lots of fish and prawns, but later they'd gone. And the seed packets there again, because that's where we started to wonder whether we should be replanting the seagrass. It came back, we didn't have to. But it did then make us think about how seagrass does recover after you lose it in a big storm like that. With the heating the world's going on, we're likely to get bigger storms. And Samantha, who's actually here, who's just got a PhD working on this, talked me into collecting dugong and turtle poo to see if those animals were acting like cassowaries, were eating the seeds and transporting them around the world. So we went out. I'll have to tell you this, day one, we didn't catch any dugong poos. Day two, I think we caught one. At the time we'd finished, we got 138, I think, in 4 hours. We are the dugong turtle poo collecting experts. On my CV, if you need turtle and dugong poo, you need to speak to us. We'll give you a price. But the seeds are in it, and what Samantha found was that there were seeds of about 4 seagrass species can be recovered from turtle and dugong poo. Around about 10% of them are viable if you go and stain them, and you get about 1 seed per gram dry weight of turtle and dugong poo. I don't know if you can imagine what 1 gram dry weight looks like, but it's not much. Dugongs have a long digestive period. I could include turtles here, but I'm simplifying it, just talking about dugongs. About 166 hours to go through a dugong gut. In that time, they can swim a couple of 100 kilometres. Mostly, though, they stay around a home range. It's sort of 50 kilometres. So in that 50 to 100 kilometre range, dugongs can move seeds around. Those seeds are viable. And as many in this area as around, so this is just the area here, around 5,000 seeds a day that are viable. The advantage of dugongs moving seeds around is they probably go to places where they know there's seagrass. I have to keep going. The other thing we did was notice that when you put a net through the water, you'll get lots of seagrass fragments, and some of those fragments are viable. So at any one time, there's lots of bits of seagrass floating around in the sea. And that's another way that meadows can recover. And Alana Gretsch from the Centre of Excellence Coral Reef Studies and I and a team decided we'd look at where those propagules will go. And we chose Townsville because we know Townsville quite well. And the 31 meadows, we used 317 release sites, and we did 68 simulations, 34 wind advection, 34 without. So it's 154,000 particles. So no seagrasses were harmed in this process. It was entirely a desktop process. We just ran particles in the water using an existing SLIM model of hydrodynamics, which includes water flows and tides. We let them go in Townsville. We used a decision process, a decision rule process, and we let them go real winds, and we let them go at 34 times during the growing season of seagrass, August and November 2011, using real wind time. So we ran these plants out to see if these particles broke off from a seagrass meadow, where would they go? We were really quite surprised at the result, because if you look at the top graphs there, just go simply to the y-axis, you'll see that those particles could go in the order of 900 kilometres before they died out. We actually killed them off through time too, so after 1.5 weeks, there's only 50% of them left. We use a curvilinear kill-off time. But there was potential for those particles, if you look at the extremes, to go all the way to the Torres Straits. So there's actually huge potential connectivity. Most of it, though, was around about that 50, 60 kilometre movement. And I can just show you what, very quickly while I'm talking. You can see the seagrass particles from Townsville heading up and down the coast, going backwards and forwards, slowly tracking north. One of the things that came out of that is the movement of particles, you can let them go in the water, is south to north in Queensland because of the way that very inshore currents and winds work. So what you do in the south in Queensland can affect the north, which is a bit of a problem since we all live down the south and that's where we do the damage. So we were quite surprised by the extent they could move. So when you see the Seagrass Meadows, there's propagules moving between them, there's dugong moving between them. It's actually quite a well-connected system. And as I promised, we'll talk about network analysis because we then used that data we had to see just how those movements between meadows will occur. So we did what's called a graph analysis. In this analysis, each of those shapes represents a meadow. The communities that are close together are the same colour. The further they are apart, the less connectivity there is. The bigger those circles are, which represent a meadow, the greater what we call betweenus centrality is, which is like a stepping stone function. And the smaller and the bigger the lines, the more actual flow between them. So these represent the meadows in the Townsville area. And I'll briefly go, I'm not going to deal with this, you have to read the paper, it's down the bottom. What it means is if you lost a meadow in the middle of Cleveland Harbour, which is really well connected, has a stepping stone meadow where particles are coming in and particles are going out, then it's most likely that meadow would recover by itself because it's so integrated. This system works as a small world network. It's tightly connected and lots of movement between them. There's no need to worry about it in Cleveland Bay. But there are other meadows like Upstart Bay and maybe Abbott Point, which are the edge of the network where they're self-replicating. Their propagules stay in the system, so they're quite resilient. They produce a lot of propagules that go out to other meadows, but they're on the edge of the network and not getting a lot of propagules in. If you lost one of those meadows in a cyclone, that may be a meadow you might want to replenish by getting in there and restoring it because it's not well connected, may not come back by itself, and it's very important to the network. So there's different meadows. Some meadows are really resilient, some meadows aren't going to be so resilient. And you can put that in a geographic basis, same network now spread out over the Townsville district. And a couple of things come up straight away. One is for we call the non-foundation, for the small colonising species, there's quite good connectivity between Deepwater and the coast. And that means if you had a big cyclone, the Deepwater seagrasses are likely to be protected because they're in deep water and they will replenish the coastal meadows, which is really good news. Not so for the bigger species, much more of a south to north movement. Now, I've cut a couple of slides out here because I knew I wouldn't be able to get done in time. But one of the things we then did with that network analysis is you can run scenarios. So we ran scenarios like all the Abbott Point seagrasses die, Cyclone Debbie, a massive flood in the Burdekin River, just to see how that would affect the connections in that network in a purely statistical sense. We're not actually doing this in the field, we're doing this in a computer. And what we found was you need an enormous impact to break that network up, around about 250 kilometre wide network impact before that network would break. It's very, very resilient. And what it means, I'm not sure how you quite describe it, but Alana said, you know, if it's suitable for restoring, it probably doesn't need restoring because we like to think of the concept of landing zone. The actual seagrass meadow is probably fairly resilient. The problem is it won't grow if the things aren't right where it's going to land. So if the sediment's wrong, the topography is wrong, the shelter's wrong, the nutrient levels are wrong, there's too much energy in the system, then there's no point restoring it because it won't grow. If those things are okay, it's probably no point restoring it either because they will grow and they'll come back by themselves. So a bit of a two-way thing. So we're in that process of seeing and trying to give good advice to people about restoration. It's very easy to get a knee-jerk reaction after a cyclone, people rush in, so we need to restore it all. The answer is no, sit on your hands and see what happens because you're looking at about a 3 or 4 year cycle where the environment has to come back to what it was before. And with a bit of luck, the seagrass will come back. If it doesn't, then you might want to get in and help it. There are a couple of places, though, that our modelling is just Townsville. There are a couple of places, Marillion Harbour is one, Paul York is doing some work there, where it's not connected to the system. It's a little marine harbour, it's just connected off by itself. And the Zostra Meadow there hasn't come back, and we're looking at, we have been doing some restoration there, I think funded by BCF. So in review then, seagrass are important. They, like all flowering plants, need lights, nutrients, suitable bottom of sediment. High energy locations and events are not good for seagrass. For goodness sake, stop boiling the world, because the more you heat the world up, the more energy you put in the system, that's going to make it very poor for seagrasses, no matter how you look at it. We always say you don't get seagrass on a surf beach because it just doesn't like high energy. The Herbivore is important. We need to know more about it. Meadows are highly connected. Consider the concept of landing zones before you start rushing in. And just to remind you, there's more seagrass and coral in the Great Barrier Reef. Thank you.
One thing that Nathan highlighted in his talk earlier is how important community is in all of the work that we do. And I'm sure there's heaps of you in the room today who have worked with Tropwater or, scientists or our land carers across our huge region here. So, just wanted to recognise all of the work that is in this room today carried with the people who are here. So we're really pleased to welcome our next speaker to the podium, as you might like to call it. Gavin is one of our Yirrakanji traditional owners from the area and has a huge experience in managing wetlands in a lot of different ways. And I'm personally really excited to hear what he has to share. So welcome, Gavin.
Thank you. Yeah, so firstly, just a bit about, firstly, I just want to start with acknowledgements again. So I think it's really important I pay respect firstly to our Buluru, within my people, Yirrakanji people. Buluru is our law, but it's also the law of the land, this law of the sea as well. And the way we believe is that these laws are written into the landscape, and they really tell us how to live, how to harvest and use our environment, how to live with it in harmony, and also the consequences of not following that law. So I just want to acknowledge Buluru first, and I want to acknowledge our Gurugura, which is our ancestors who have gone before us. This even includes our past leaders that have gone before us, and so we're standing on their shoulders and carrying on their vision and the hard work that they've done in the past. I want to acknowledge our Bulumba. Our word Bulumba means land and sea at our home. It's a collective term, and really, it's a really deep meaning to that word, and also to our Bama. So acknowledging all the different First Nations traditional owner groups across Australia, across North Queensland, up into the Torres Strait as well. So our Bama, rainforest Aboriginal people, but also across the Great Barrier Reef as well. And I want to acknowledge CAFNEC and JCU for allowing this opportunity for me to speak today. So thank you. I think a lot of it is pretty straightforward. We're kind of should all be familiar with the role wetlands play, that importance, and just stating the obvious there around the filtration, filtering those pollutants, the water quality, the carbon storage, and just that third space, that connection between land and water, or between land and sea, depending which type of wetland. As we know, there are diversity in different wetlands, depending on what margin they sit on, those ecotones, and also the biodiversity and the flora and fauna within our wetland systems, whether that be coastal and the marine or within the inland systems. And I kind of really want to just paint that picture, because when I close my eyes and I picture a wetland or picture a swamp, what kind of trees do you see? What kind of animals do you see when you think about these are unique, important systems, and that sort of leads me on to looking at from a cultural lens, from our cultural perspective, from a traditional owner perspective, I guess, and going from that, traditional owners have been for generations living, using, and looking after wetland areas across the country, across the landscape, knowing that the landscape and environment has really shaped who we are. So our laws, our customs, our beliefs, and it also shapes our way of living. So how we live, hunt, gather, harvest, use, and manage are all intertwined, interconnected with the environment. And what's also important here is to note that our cultural values are quite diverse, also sensitive. As we know, a lot of different traditional owner groups have their own set of cultural values, beliefs, and it will really differ from area to area in terms of geography. One sort of important thing to note is our storylines. So our storylines, once upon a time, believed to be like fairy tales or legends, but to us, it's really the law of the land. It really shows us and guides us through those protocols on country. It also teaches us those real key messages about relationships and connectivity between different places. Also, if we're not following those types of protocols, those rules in there, if we're not following it in terms of management or use, those consequences could be detrimental or could be significant. And one example is our storyline right here. Across Australia, we have all our different stories, but for here in this particular region, we tell a story of Buraji, the scrub python. And this story about this animal creating what we know now as the Barron River. And with this story, it tells us different places that are linked. So not just the river, but different springs that are linked to the waterway, but also coral reefs sitting outside. So a double island. So now it brings in the island, the mountains, which are all connected, and understanding the system really, really drives our work on the ground. And obviously, wetlands having that connection to that linkage to Bana, water. And we know that water is life, water is sacred, and everything about it. And when we look at our biocultural values, this talks about our culturally significant or totemic plants and animals. So cultural indicator species, we really looks at identifying those types of indicators. I like to use our language terms for all of these things. So julwa, some of our mollusks, our mussels, and nyingara, so different eels species, our guyu, so fish larvae, and also our ngawayu and duyan, so turtle and dugong, and some of those pollinators. So understanding that system within our law system, and then also acknowledging within wetlands there are also cultural heritage sites amongst the wetland areas in the mangroves, swamps, whether that be shell midden sites, camps, traditional tracks going through, and then there's also areas where no one was allowed to go for various reasons. And this is the way how we used our landscape and wetland areas, and also respecting those animals, those ecosystems that are there. And also the roles that traditional owners play in terms of going down into family level groupings, clan level, or within male or female specific areas as well. And we all have a role to play, and we all have a role to play in terms of managing specific areas under our traditional law system. Now, with here's just a little little list of some of the impacts and threats and challenges that we're facing every day within our wetland systems, and we've been facing for a long time. And it's just an ongoing battle in terms of those changes into the water regimes, those changes within the landscape due to historical, tree clearing, farming, and all those different practices, and the degrading of those wetland systems. Even with natural events, with the cyclones, the changing of waterway systems from cyclones, and then putting in cement, so changing the river channels as well, and also those impacts of rubbish and invasive species on our system. So, and also with saltwater and tidal inundation, which is changing the system, and especially around our coastal swamps, which some that were naturally freshwater and now getting impacted in from the high sea level rise, and also storm surge, and also those impacts to some of our cultural values as well. On top of that, then we also got restricted access, especially for traditional owner groups that continue their traditional practices to access areas, and for continuing our cultural management responsibilities on country. There's always the challenge of resources, building capacity, having the right capacity and capability to deliver those on-ground actions, but also being involved and engaged within policy and planning, and really into the decision-making within our wetlands across the country. And always the challenge with the red tape around tenure and the politics at the end of the day. But from our perspective, there are a lot of different opportunities. I know over the past, there's a lot of different plans that have been developed, not just by the mainstream government, state, Commonwealth, but even on the international level, and even local traditional owner group communities developing their own plans. And some examples are here. I think traditional owners have been fortunate to have some of their actions recognised within the Reef 2050 plan. There are about 23 actions there that really drive or support traditional owner aspirations on looking after country, particularly the reef, but also wetland systems inside. The Great Barrier Reef Blueprint for Resilience, although looks at the restoration, intervention type work, it's also acknowledging some of those traditional Indigenous knowledge within that plan. Just recently, probably a few years ago, the Strong People, Strong Country framework as well has been a key driver in some of the reef work today, bringing back in a lot of the past work that's been done and keeping it up to date. So some of the key sort of actions coming out of that Strong People, Strong Country framework, which was developed across the Great Barrier Reef from a number of different key people, and looks at the healthy country, healthy people concept, the connectivity between people and the sea or the reef and the wetlands, and really talks about how traditional owners want to drive those actions for their own communities. The Reef Plan, all the work through the NRM body and through all the hard work from all the community putting in into the Reef Plan, and part of that was the 2008 Great Barrier Reef Indigenous Water Quality Wetlands Project, and the plan that was developed that fed into the Reef Plan. Around that, some of the sort of the common components of those plans, if I pull them out, some of the key ones were engagement. So for traditional owners to be more engaged within policy, planning, decision making, and even the on-ground monitoring and conservation work within wetlands. There's also a push for Indigenous water values to be more recognised and being implemented on the ground. Also, the action around restoration, rehabilitation. In terms of climate change on the international level, they speak more about that engagement within policy and also within knowledge application. So the application and use of traditional knowledge to enhance or inform conservation work. Also, the Sustainable Development Goals. I think we're kind of in the international arena. It's moving more towards those SDGs, and you know, what we're doing down on the ground needs to be picked up on the international level and the national level, because a lot of our positive on-ground work that's happening is being forgotten or being missed. Now, a lot of traditional owner groups are getting more involved in conservation work on the ground and developing and establishing their own programs, business models, and in terms of monitoring as well. And there's also a lot of opportunities always more often now around funding and procurement opportunities. So for traditional owner groups, organisations to provide service delivery for government, non-government industry as well. And there's an opportunity here around that continued protection, so renaming our wetlands, but also listing different flora and fauna and ecosystems for their cultural values as well. In terms of our efforts, you know, I guess I can be honest that we're quite new in the game as in terms of our Yirrakanji community programs, but you know, there are a lot of other traditional owner groups out there, organisations who are becoming more involved in conservation within wetlands, within the catchment, or within the reef space. There are ranger programs being set up here and there, up and down the coast. So getting more involved within that mangrove restoration work, revegetation work, and here in the local area, we've been involved in, you know, planting mangroves along Tomatis Creek. We've been involved in removing rubbish and collaborating, and sometimes I think, you know, we're spreading ourselves too thin. But you know, getting out there, getting involved, and trying to make a change within these wetland systems. Quite ambitious, quite positive, but you know, we always got those challenges always there ahead of us. We've been involved in a lot of our bird monitoring work. Probably in the last 5 years, we now lead the Michaelmas Cay bird surveys out of Cairns. So we lead it in partnership with Queensland Parks and Wildlife Service, and you know, we get in some really good you know, observations and findings within the Michaelmas Cay area with some of our birds coming in and out, and also along the Barron River mouth as well. Coral reef restoration, groups are becoming more interested, more involved in that space as well. Out of Cairns, there are a number of different projects happening at the moment, different methods of intervention, but also looking at reef noise and other things like that to try and attract fish larvae and try and promote coral growth through those other different methods. Some groups down south are looking at cultural waterways assessment type for waterways and wetlands. So assessing waterways based on the cultural values, picking out what different plants, animals that would have been there hundreds of years ago until what they are now, and how do we restore some of these areas based on that knowledge, based on history as well. Going back to our historical photographs, looking at the landscape where the river used to flow, understanding that flow of water, also where the fresh and salt water used to meet and where it meets now. So it's understanding all those different things, and which might help inform us with our conservation approach. Education awareness. Now, some groups don't have ranger programs. Some groups don't have monitoring programs set up, but some of them are doing really good, interesting, positive community activities, whether that be doing school talks and engagement, providing that education out and outreaching to our young people, but also doing beach cleanups, tree planting, and all those type of activities as well. So again, I guess I'm repeating myself here, but what needs to be done from our perspective, I think that we've got a lot to learn from a lot of our historical data and Indigenous knowledge system to inform conservation, particularly example with the Katana Wetlands area, understanding that system, how it was hundreds of years ago, what it is now, and how do we fix that problem. Also trusting in resourcing, investing in traditional owner-led conservation business models. I think, you know, in the past, our funding bodies have been hesitant on funding traditional owner groups for various reasons, but I think, you know, now it's a time to start trusting and investing in some of these business models and really collaborating with these traditional knowledge system. How do we bring knowledge systems together, and how do we really combine it and drive ongoing action? Also around education, communication, you know, we know that education is the key, trying to communicate those messages out there. Like I said, a lot of our local stories are not being heard in the international level, or Australia is not picking up those positive stories and telling it to the wider community. And we do need a long-term commitment and protection of our wetland areas. One example is with the Mangrove Wetlands here at the Cairns Airport area. You know, we do need to have long-term commitment, protection of these areas that are special to us. I mean, that's what it's all about in terms of Ramsar. Anyway, I haven't got much to add, but other than, yeah, I think I'll leave more time for questions. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Gavin. And we're going to have, I'm going to come back to the screen. We're going to have a Q&A panel at the end of this, so we'll save questions for all of our speakers to the end now. Yeah, I think Gavin brought some really important points up there. I think the time I had a little giggle when you called yourself new to the game, because you might be new to the game and having a ranger group, but I think 40 to 60,000 years worth of knowledge is not necessarily new to the game in the context of some of our knowledge in the room. And I really think some of the important points you brought up around law, the law that traditional owners have being about the relationship to nature, rather than some of the laws that we have, being sort of either, stick or incentive, having how we manage our land really based in that relationship. And, not only asking ourselves, because I think many of our traditional owner groups are spread thin on the ground because there is so much work to do. So not only how can we learn from the work that you do, but how can we lift it up and make sure we're sharing those stories, because many of us have a platform that some of our traditional owner groups don't. So thank you so much for sharing all of that knowledge, and we'll save questions for the end. So next we're going to welcome, one more round of applause for Gavin. So I'm going to invite Dennis up here, who's going to show two videos, actually. We're going to mix it up a bit and have some video entertainment. And I'll let Dennis talk to you about what these videos are briefly before he shows them. So welcome, Dennis.
Oh, thanks very much, Lucy. Actually, there's one video, and one is Pechacucha. Those of you who know me know that I've been working on East Trinity issues for God knows how many years, actually, longer than I wish. And the East Trinity concept, referring to you, Nathan, about takes 20 years sometimes for something to actually advance. This goes back to 2000. So we'll start with the East Trinity story. It's a Pechacucha, which is 20 slides with 20 seconds per slide. So it's 6 minutes and 40 seconds. It was uploaded into YouTube, and it's when you see the syncing, you'll sometimes see it doesn't quite work with the threads as I'm speaking, and there's a little bit of a sort of an asynchronous, if you like, or a disconnect between some of the slides and when I'm speaking, but it is 3 years old, and it's still pretty much what's happening at East Trinity to this day. And I was there actually on Saturday, and I'll tell you about that during the Q&A at the end, but it is still, it is advancing, and this is the story of East Trinity. Although my story is about love too, but it's a lot more prosaic. It's a love affair that I've had with East Trinity for the last 25 years of environmental activism. This is the jewel close to my heart, apart from my beloved wife, of course.
I might just see if we can get that.
It was blazing loud earlier. Oh, here we go, master.
I think I've turned it up as far as it goes. But it just wasn't quite as loud as it was before.
Although my story is about love too, but it's a lot more prosaic. It's a love affair that I've had with East Trinity for the last 25 years of environmental activism. This is the jewel close to my heart, apart from my beloved wife, of course. And it's just 15 minutes across from Trinity Inlet from the CBD. So as we sit at Mondo's drinking our pina coladas, most of us have no idea what lies behind the Shangri-La, full of promise, lying hidden beneath a mangrove curtain. So note Hills Creek there going up, and the Bund Wall. I'll be coming back to that, so it's important that you recognize that wall running along there, because that's part of the story that's really important. We've got to have a look and see what it was like there in 1952. This is it, looking at the CBD, and then you see the 4 creek systems that are just going to appear, coming up from the bottom, Firewood, Magazine, Hills, and George. And notice the extensive salt pans that are just going to appear. These are now a very rare habitat indeed. This is the boring but necessary slide to tell you what went wrong. The land was bought for sugarcane but failed due to an acid sulfate soil exposure. It was bought back by the state government in 2000 under pressure from the conservation movement, and it's been rehabilitated since 2001. So what are these horrible, nasty acid sulfate soils? They're naturally occurring iron sulfate soils, very common in northern Australia and Southeast Asia, which are formed under waterlogged conditions and are okay if left undisturbed. That's the key. They must be left undisturbed. But when the soils are drained, excavated, or exposed to air by a lowering of the water table, as happened with the construction of the Bund Wall, the soils react with oxygen to form sulfuric acid. So what you're looking at there in the water is pretty much pure sulfuric acid. Hard to imagine that in a landscape so close to Cairns. This is what it looked like in 1989. Pretty scary stuff. Now, some developers and politicians, those of you who have been here for a long time will know, thought the best solution to fix it was to build an artificial reef and satellite city complete with bridge. But our group, Save Trinity Inlet, argued strongly for its restoration. And this is how it's restored. It's done through a tidal exchange at Hills Creek and the various other river systems within the Bund. We won, and the fixing takes place now through a team called the Acid Sulfate Soil Team from the Queensland State Government. And you see the tidal exchange taking place with the acidified water on the other side. This slide here shows the first part of the treatment that took place in the early 2000s. It was a consequence of the tidal exchange. You see the melaleucas in the top, actually in the bottom slide, starting to die. And that's a natural casualty of the change in the regime. Other parts took a bit longer. So this is Firewood Creek undergoing rehab in the 2000s. And you can see the transition is taking place, but gradually fish started to reappear in big numbers, and the fingerlings now sustain and feed into the Great Barrier Reef in great numbers. So look at the difference more recently as mangroves really start to displace the old regime. It's really beginning to start to look like Kakadu. And by the way, the property is about 740 hectares and goes right up to the Yarrabah Road. But that looks pretty magic, doesn't it? Likewise, this is the firewood oxbow, as they call it. This is only 7 years ago, and you can see the effects of the acid sulfate soil poking through there. It's worth mentioning now that the work being done here is actually being used also in Southeast Asia in the rehabilitation of many of the problem areas there too. Look at that slide. So you can see here the transformation that's taken place. And it's victories like this that present opportunities to the field research team from the Southern Cross University in New South Wales, who have been expanding the study program in transferring their skills and taking it into Southeast Asia. It's just a shame that James Cook University didn't pick up the baton in the 2000s and missed out on this wonderful research opportunity. This is Hills Creek, heading southeast towards the hills, where a huge effort has gone into liming through the controlled tidal flow and the addition of lime. And you'll see in a minute, this slide here almost makes me feel like weeping with joy. You can actually see the transformation. Despite this beauty, over the last few years, we at CAFNEC, I'm the president at CAFNEC, have been fighting against another battle to dump dredge spoil there. And less than 2 months ago, we won! So we're not going to dump there. Now, you can almost hear the relief in this restored habitat exfoliating in relief. Imagine, by analogy, spending big to renovate your house only for Wally muck demolition to wantonly knock it down and use it as a dump site. Horrific. For many years, those of you who know me, I've been the spokesperson for a wetlands park proposal for East Trinity. And the potential, look at it, it's beautiful, isn't it, is huge. And recently, those of you who have been reading the papers will notice that the Mandingalba Yidinji traditional owners have been looking into tourist economic potential through a similar idea to the one that we developed. This nature slide shows on a birding trip, just by the way, recently we identified 93 different species in 4 hours. 93 different species. So you'll recognize the jabiru, you'll recognize the crop. Up there on the top right, beachstone curlews, which is now a rare species, and the Latham snipe on the bottom right. This is just 15 minutes from Cairns by boat. Surely this is worth protecting in perpetuity and saying no to dredge, spot dumping, satellite cities, bridges or tunnels. This is the green lung, the glorious backdrop that separates us from the cityfied Cairns. But there's still work to be done. You can see the acidified area on Magazine Creek, which is the area next to Firewood, just a little bit above. That's the final part of the rehab jigsaw, and it's the only creek that still is not open to the sea to allow for tidal exchange. So there's still work to be done, and that continues through the research and the study.
Okay, that's it. I can assure you, when I did that, the syncing was perfect. That somehow when it's gone up on YouTube, the sync has slightly gone out of kilter. But anyway, that's the story of East Trinity. And I was just saying, just very briefly, before I move to the next one, trying to do that in 6 minutes and 40 seconds was something, I can tell you, because I used to do it. I used to do the presentation. Normally, it was like a standard presentation, 20 minutes or half an hour or whatever with questions. Anyway, so the other little segment within my 15 minutes is Jack Barnes. So there's the two issues, completely different, but still linked into the wetlands issue that we've been discussing this evening, and of course, significant in relation to Ramsar. Gavin's already alluded to it, and this is a lovely little piece of video that's been put together by a wonderful woman called Kate with the support of CAFNEC. Here it is.
My name is John Breen. I worked for Cairns City Council from 1981 to 1989, and during that time I was asked to design and construct the Jack Barnes Mangrove Boardwalk. The construction of the boardwalk took 18 months and it was built by a dedicated team of 7 people. It was built at the location for a number of reasons. One was that there were or are a lot of different mangrove species there. It's close to the city of Cairns. Also, it had additional features of interest like the central salt pan and also the creek towards the northern loop. Before the design process started, there was a piece of timber that floated in on the tide, which was like a long stick, 2 metres long. And I pushed that into the mangrove mud with little to no resistance. And I knew about all of the bamboo on the Red Arrow track on Mount Whitfield. So it was just like a light bulb moment to use that 8 metre long bamboo and to support it with PVC above that.
I've been an environmental scientist at James Cook University for over 40 years. I'm a biogeographer by training, but I've become interested in a lot of other areas, particularly to do with managing natural environments. Mangroves, to me, are one of the most fascinating groups of plants on the planet. And they all have done something quite remarkable. They've adapted to living in seawater, and yet they are land plants. So you've got a complex environment that's not just the mangrove species. So there's lots of interesting diversity within the Jack Barnes Boardwalk, and it's something I haven't seen on any other mangrove boardwalk. It's very interesting that this council initiative many years ago has drawn attention from all over the world. It's not just people in Cairns and our region that love it and have used it and value it.
My name's Terry Mulqueen and I'm a teacher at the Holloway Beach Environmental Education Centre. One of the things that we do there is we educate students about mangroves. It's interesting because initially people think that mangroves are quite a scary environment, mud and crabs and sandflies and mosquitoes, and I'm not going to say that those things don't exist. They absolutely do. But it's only when you really connect and come in and see how amazing they are that you start to care for it. When people first come in and they're a bit reticent to set foot in the mangroves, to walking out and having that understanding and that real appreciation is, it's amazing. Yeah.
I'm Gavin Singleton from the Yirraganji Truslana Group. I'm a project manager with the Dulwuru Aboriginal Corporation with the Yirrakanji Land and Sea Ranger Program. Our traditional name for this area is Burumbul, but also being part of Birragara, the Bowen River. We still have our traditional names, our cultural purposes for all of our mangroves here and the role that they play in our traditional society, but also into today. They're still really, really important for us. People, Yirraganji people, we'd like to acknowledge Jack Barnes and the boardwalk that is named in his honour, remembering his contributions to the environment here within the mangroves of the Cairns Airport area.
Hello, I'm Hidetoshi, or friends call me Mikey, or some people call me seasoned scientist, because I discovered 2 new mangroves added to the list of Australian mangroves. On these discoveries, Jack Barnes Mangrove Boardwalk did a big help for me, not only learning about mangrove itself, but also learning about the whole ecosystem of the mangroves. We walk into the yellow mangroves, you find so many jewel butterflies flying everywhere. I've never seen anywhere else so many butterflies flying in a small area. If you look down, you find giant mudskippers covered by mosquitoes. You also find the crabs struggling to bring large leaves into small hole. You can also hear all different mangrove sounds, like popping noise from shrimps. and you can hear different types of crickets. For scientists, I believe that Jack Barnes Mangrove Watch current location will lead us more discoveries in the future.
I've been a landscape photographer for about 25 years, and I've been to a lot of wonderful parts of Australia, and particularly Northern Australia, and having lived in Cairns for all of that time, I've always just been totally amazed by the beauty. Coming into the boardwalk here, you get to witness these fabulously interesting buttressed mangrove forests, and they're beautiful and tall like rainforests. They're absolutely fascinating. They're full of wildlife, full of bird life, and to be here and to be able to access the mangrove forests comfortably, you know, so you can walk right through all of these wonderful changing forests as they come in and out of their ranges, as the forest changes from one type of mangrove to the other. It's just it's a visual delight, and it's an ecological wonderland.
I don't think there's many mangrove boardwalks in the world anyway, and I certainly haven't seen anything close to that in other areas. The boardwalk's always had a soft spot in my heart.
Just before I pass you back to Lucy. Before I pass, okay, that's it. Before I pass you back to Lucy, I just want to thank Kerry. I forgot to do that for the last one, and Stephen for their wonderful aerial slides, shots of East Trinity. So it wouldn't have been the same without you guys and the wonderful photography that you guys produce. It's amazing. They're wonderful people, and what an attribute they are to Far North Queensland, you know. And also, I also want to thank Lucy, because she's not going to be talking about it. She's doing a different thing, but the tremendous support, because I know you're going to be asking me this question, that the airport have provided for the maintenance and protection of the Jack Barnes Boardwalk, and we are working our way through that right now with the endeavours of the original engineer, John Breen, and the airport infrastructure manager, and also the ARUP officer there, engineer in charge of ARUP, and they're all doing that free, gratis and for nothing, fighting for ways to advocate for the protection of the boardwalk and using the money that would have been used to rip it up in its saving and maintenance and ongoing upkeep. So good news at the end of that. Thank you.
And also thank you to Dennis, who, for those of you who don't know, being the president of CAFNEC is not a paid role, and he does put a huge amount of work into protecting a lot of areas around this region. We're going to hear from one more speaker, but because I am who I am, I can't help but plug Mangrove Watch. We have had Mikey, who's in the room with us today, discovering new mangrove species. We've got 400 kilometres of shoreline data now from volunteers going out with our Mangrove Watch program and monitoring those areas. And as a part of that, you know, for the first time last year, we actually went out and thanks to Dennis and his connections, were able to do monitoring in East Trinity. And having grown up in this area and known the story of East Trinity, I was really excited to go and walk around in what is a restricted area and actually look at what's happening on the ground there. And we're hoping to go back and do more monitoring in East Trinity. And also every mangrove expedition I did in high school and at university included the Jack Barnes Boardwalk. So I'm sure many of us have that scientific and community connection to the Jack Barnes Boardwalk. And we have information about that work that our community is doing to have it remain in our community on our website if you want to check it out. So just plugging that before I pass over to our last speaker before we go into our Q&A panel. So write those questions down. Lucy Friend, always a great name to invite to the stage, from the airport here in Cairns, is going to speak to us about some of the blue carbon work that's happening and some of the ambitions around that. And I think this is one of our most up and coming fields in climate change and wetlands. So it's really exciting to welcome Lucy to the stage. I will speak with more oomph. Is that better? No worries. Lucy has a quiet voice, so I'll encourage her to speak with oomph as well.
Thank you. Let me know if it's not working. Thank you, Lucy. And I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and the elders past, present and emerging. As we heard from Gavin, the connection to country is still very important for wetlands and in general. So I've been with Cairns Airport now around 5 years, and my role there requires me to be a generalist. So I don't pretend to be an expert on blue carbon, but I have been speaking with some of the experts on this topic for the last 3 years since we started looking at the airport's carbon footprint and using blue carbon as a way to offset some of that. I've also found myself as part of the federal government's blue carbon working group, which I'll talk about a bit later as well, and the emission reduction fund. I also just really love mangroves, so I think that's maybe why Dennis asked me to come up today as well. I just think they're amazing ecosystems. We often forget them. We speak about the reef a lot and the rainforests, which are of course really important, but we do tend to forget about the mangroves in between. And in this area in particular, they're so diverse and so beautiful that I struggle to understand why we do forget them as much as we do. Can everyone hear me okay? Is that okay? Yeah, thanks, Seb. So I grew up in Cairns, and I started my field work quite young. It's up there twice, isn't it? But I do have more respect for PPE and for crocodile habitat now that I work in the field in a professional capacity. And when I was young, I loved climbing mangrove roots, and they were just the most beautiful playgrounds. And my sister and I would find mudskippers and fiddler crabs and occasionally crocodile sunbaking. And they were just the most amazing ecosystems to grow up in. The concept of carbon offsets and blue carbon, it just wasn't even a thing for me as a kid. And the concept of blue carbon generally, I think, is quite new, relatively new anyway. So blue carbon, just to take a step back, is the carbon stock sequestered by the world's oceans. So if it's locked up in biomass in the mud and in the plants, then it's not in the atmosphere causing greenhouse gases, so causing the warming. If we look at the literature, so they do a really good job of holding carbon. So when we talk about blue carbon ecosystems, these are the ecosystems that are using carbon to build themselves. So the main ones here are tidal marshes, mangroves and seagrasses. And actually, I don't know if you can read the numbers that well from my screenshot, but the average for mangroves in Australia is 125 tonnes of carbon per hectare that it can hold above ground, and then 251 tonnes of carbon per hectare below ground. So a lot of that biomass, a lot of that carbon is actually below ground in the mud. And then there's a drawdown rate for the sequestration of around 1.26 tonnes per hectare per year. And this is an average, so there's a lot of variation across the country, or even in one mangrove ecosystem, but particularly across the country. So as well as bringing down carbon from the atmosphere, these blue carbon ecosystems also have a whole heap of co-benefits. So everyone likes pretty birds, so I thought I'd put that one up there. These are lovely fairy wrens that were captured by a PhD student just beside the airport in Cairns. so these mangrove habitats are allowing these species to survive. Without them, they wouldn't. So that's a co-benefit of keeping these ecosystems healthy. Also, mangroves are filtering the runoff from the land, so bringing out nutrient and sediment, using that to build themselves, but also protecting the reef from those sediments that would smother them. At the same time, they provide the habitat for the fish species that the reef needs to survive. Mangroves also protect our infrastructure, so that's particularly important for the airport. As you can see, it's right next to the ocean and right next to the Barron River. So the mangroves in a healthy state will be protecting, like slowing those winds down, slowing the storm surge, and protecting the banks from erosion as well. And of course, maintaining healthy mangrove ecosystems is really important for that protection of cultural heritage values. So it's, as we heard from Gavin, that they do go hand in hand, and that is really important. And when we don't protect them, they turn from being these amazing ecosystems that support life and protect our infrastructure and give us a sense of place to an ecosystem that can start emitting carbon. So we have to be careful of that too when we aren't looking after them, because they can start being part of that problem in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So one of the things that the government's working at the moment, and that's so I mentioned at the start that I've been part of the federal government's working group for blue carbon methods, which is not at all an easy name to remember, or I probably get it wrong every time, but that group is working in with the Clean Energy Regulator to work out a way to incorporate blue carbon into the Emissions Reduction Fund. So under the Emission Reduction Fund, the fund can start to provide methods for farmers of carbon to generate Australian carbon credit units, or ACCUs. So that would be a way of trading carbon and provide funding for carbon farmers that are wanting to get financial support to potentially do those projects that are improving the drawdown of carbon in those blue carbon ecosystems. And those carbon credit units can be sold to offset carbon, so either sold back to the government or to the private sector to offset emissions. Of course, offsetting is not always the best thing to go to first. They should only be offset until they can be eliminated. And also, this is Australia, so a lot of companies that operate internationally and have branches in Australia might not weight this particularly heavily because it is in the Australian context. And offsets aren't currently part of the science-based targets for emissions reductions either. But this is something that's, I think it's a good start, and the more we can appreciate mangroves and the other blue carbon ecosystems for their values, the better. So it's exciting to see some of that work coming in from the federal government, and hopefully in a couple of years or potentially even this year, the blue carbon might be incorporated into the Emissions Reduction Fund. But mangroves are quite different to terrestrial ecosystems, so there's a lot of things to work out still with that. This is an example of a mangrove ecosystem that had a bunge wall put in to put a road in to allow access to part of the airport. And as you can see, it's not doing so well. It's been like that for quite a number of years, and it's just slowly not been able to cope with that change of habitat. So one of the things that the Clean Energy Regulator are focusing on is projects that restore the tidal flow to these damaged ecosystems, to allow these mangrove ecosystems to come back, mangroves and salt marshes, to come back and start functioning as a healthy ecosystem again, which will then naturally draw down carbon and start to grow more biomass. And then all of those co-benefits come with it. So after years of looking at different ways of farming blue carbon, that's what the Clean Energy Regulator has landed on as probably the most viable way to farm blue carbon, is to reintroduce tidal flow. So that could be a farmer that's willing to give back part of the land to allow tidal flow to come back in to paddocks that are modified for cane or for cattle, or it could be conservationists buying land and revegetating it. But hopefully, following those methods, and when they do get it into the emissions reduction fund, then that would be supported by the Australian carbon credit units and as a way of trading carbon. I am quick, so you don't need your notes, Lucy, but I didn't want to leave the slide on that picture. So just to finish up, I did want to summarise by saying mangroves and salt marshes are really awesome. We've heard that a lot tonight, as are seagrasses. I do have a new appreciation for those, Rob. And so many people in this region are working really hard to appreciate these ecosystems and to make the whole region better. So I did want to appreciate those people as well, and a lot of whom are in this room. So thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. And I'll invite all of our speakers to come up to the stools in the middle here as we're going to go into our Q&A time. Unfortunately, Gavin's had to go to another event where he's speaking tonight, but we're really privileged to have Liz Owen and Dennis Arkey joining us here tonight from Jarragon Eco Services, who are some traditional owners from down in the Mangrove area. One of the things that really stood out for me when we talk about the carbon credits, and I think there's a lot of people who've been working towards, creating a system where we can account for the carbon that our natural ecosystems sequester, but there's also a really big conversation happening not just about biodiversity co-benefits, but also a lot about our cultural co-benefits as well. And a lot of you would know about the Land Restoration Fund and some of the work they're trying to do to properly price those co-benefits. So there's still a long way to go in really getting our carbon credit, and I think we're still at a very low number compared to some areas in Europe when it comes to our price per unit for our carbon. So hopefully we can start getting a government that makes us more competitive in the carbon market, because we certainly do have a lot of environments that can help us in that space. So I'll invite our speakers up to the middle here, if that's all right. So we've got Dennis and Lucy and the other Dennis and Liz and Nathan and Rob, if you'd all like to join us. So this is a moment to we've got a bit of time still, so we've managed to make up our time, which is really great, because I always find that and if you need to get a more normal chair to roll into the centre as well, I think that's fine, or shorter chair. But usually some of the most insightful moments of these events is when we get to ask those burning questions that we've had. So what we'll do is I will do my best at memorizing who has questions and come around to you. But I will say before we go to questions that sometimes this can be a moment where people like to share their ideas rather than ask a question. I think we've all been there before, so I'm going to out loud that before we get started and really ask that if you have a question, find out what that question is in your head and then think about how you would say it in a sentence, and then put your hand up, because it always makes it much easier for our speakers to answer you in a way that's useful for everyone in the room. So just going to out loud that before we start. So does anyone have a well-articulated question they'd like to ask our amazing speakers tonight? All right, I've got lots of hands. I'm going to go this way. And also remembering that we do have folks in the Webosphere, and we'll see if we can get to questions there as well. So I'll go to Stu.
Does the panel have any views on the values of the wetlands in the Gulf of Carpentaria? We've focused here a lot on the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon. What about the Gulf?
Okay, and you're going to have to bear with me because I only have one microphone, but I've got long legs, so, we're lucky. Would anybody like to answer that question? Yep, Rob.
We've got a lot of information from the Gulf of Carpentaria. We've collected, I think we started monitoring seagrass there in about 1981. It's currently all sitting in a very poor form though. We have money to put it in electronic form in the Great Barrier Reef. We'd very much like to do that for the Gulf of Carpentaria before the people who did those surveys retire and move on. So there is a fair bit of information. We've flown the Gulf from TI to Nullarbor several times since in the 2000s. I flew it recently, was it 2018, I think, with Norm Duke to look at the mangrove dieback. For those of you who don't know, there's massive mangrove dieback started in the Gulf in about 2015, I think about 10,000 hectares, which is germane to the blue carbon issue because these are trees 100 years old that died really rapidly with a sea level drop and a lot of temperature and dry conditions. So hugely concerning, massive dieback. It's a shame I didn't know you can ask a question. I could have brought a video along of some of that mangrove. You'd be horrified because it's just, I mean, if it happened in Cairns, just imagine what it'd be like if 10,000 hectares of rainforest behind Cairns died and you were left with barren hills behind you. People would be absolutely outraged if that happened. But because it's the Gulf of Carpentaria, it's a little bit out of the way. It's kind of drifted into the background a bit. We're still monitoring it, but it's really expensive working in the Gulf. Alex and I and Kath have got a project up in Murray country now, Muriel Island in Limnan Bight, starting later in the year. But that's just very limited in nature, looking at the marine park there. So we are interested. We've got permanent monitoring sites in Corumba and Weipa, where we go every year to monitor seagrass and Torres Straits as well. So there is quite a bit of data from the Gulf. We certainly are interested in it. It's much harder to get money to do research in the Gulf of Carpentaria. It doesn't have the cachet of the Great Barrier Reef and the tourist industry. There's lots of turtles and dugongs, there's lots of mangroves, heaps of seagrass, lots of variability, and some really big cultural values to the local Aboriginal communities. So it's just a little bit out of sight, out of mind for the mainstream kind of thought and media that drives interest and money and science in this world, I'm afraid. The only reason we're there is because of national parks and ports.
Thanks for the answer, Rob. And I found another microphone. And I think there was a lot of media attention at the time, if you weren't aware of that dieback that happened in the Gulf. And so there are some articles that are still up online that you can find. But yeah, I think there's still a lot of work to be done in funding the work that happens in that area. Did you want to say something, Nathan?
I'll just add to that possibly as well. Environmental flows, the hydrology is so variable, as Rob said, and you know, what connects the vegetation to fishery production is water. Water is the vector for moving carbon around, energy to drive food chains. If we keep changing the hydrology naturally through climate change or water resource development, that's going to further impact coastal fishery production.
So you wouldn't be referring to the 8 dams that are on the horizon for the Far North Queensland region, would you, Nathan? No? There'll be some more information coming to light over that, I think, in the coming months. So I'll move on to the next question and we'll mix up the answers from our different speakers.
Hi, this question is mostly for Nathan, but I was just wondering whether you're aware of many or any long-term funding models for restoration, and how would you advocate for this?
There is a fantastic funding model on the Burdekin, Sheep Station Creek. It's a small distribution channel. It's actually a natural creek which has been turned into an irrigation distribution channel. Has a named creek. It's called Sheep Station Creek. For the last 20 years, there's been a riparian management agreement in place where the funding is coming from, it's from the Water Board, the local farmers, the NQ Dry Tropics, and farmers themselves put money into this pool, which then is used to harvest the aquatic weeds and keep that under control. It's been in place 20 years. That funding model is absolutely brilliant, and I really think we should be looking very closely at that, going forward. If we think about large-scale restoration projects on floodplains, we do need those long-term funding models to keep it going. Otherwise, the weeds will just come back.
And I'd be interested to know if Dennis or Liz had any comment on that, as other folk who are working on ground on restoration?
Yeah, I have. We established and drafted up a catchment management program for the Russell River catchment. Now, that came really out of doing a couple of reef rescue projects. And at the end of it was, well, what do we do now? So we had to actually dip in our own pocket and get a geomorphic study done of the river system within the catchment. That's what led us to develop the plan itself, which was all self-funded, because we knew there's no way anybody would fund a geomorphic study or anybody would fund a plan such as this. But what it's come around to is that now that we've presented it to the state government, federal government, Great Barrier Reef Foundation, they all agree this is a good thing. That's as far as it goes. But, you know, we're still hanging in there. And it's very difficult to plan these things because we're dealing with a highly modified environment. Previously, all wetland, Melaleuca swamp, and now it's all been drained. There's no Melaleucas around. There's probably a little bit here and there. But that is the problem. And now they're starting to realise on a lot of these cane farms that the land that was what they thought was productive isn't anymore. So I'd like to know who's got some money so we can buy some of these cane farms so we can put bloody wetlands on them.
And it sounds like, I think from what Nathan said and some of the experiences we've been having with some of the work that CAFNEC's been doing is those integrated funding models that have a lot of different inputs from different partners make things last for a lot longer, and particularly if you can get landholders involved. And knowing that we've restored a lot of the public land that exists in our region, I think we need to start focusing on that private land. I'm going to keep going on to the next question.
Good evening. Firstly, I'd like to recognise the traditional owners of country, emerging leaders, past and present. My name's Chelsea. I'm from Friends of the Reef Associates. My question is, does the board have any knowledge or idea of the preservation of current non-registered wetland sites of parks and wildlife?
Anyone feel like they might be able to answer that question? And I think it's about wetlands that aren't yet registered, and that might be of importance.
Yeah, just say a few words. When I mentioned earlier that you had Ramsar listing at Chelsea, when Peter Hitchcock was alive and we were advocating for the wetlands part, we looked into Ramsar listing for the Cairns Basin. And just so you know, the birds that fly down from on the Eastern Pacific Flyway, the first stop they make when they come down is Cairns. There's nothing north of Cairns. And the next one really is Bowling Green Bay, which is south of Townsville. So when the rehabilitation of East Trinity was taking place, one of the things that we put to government was the possibility of some kind of tenure that would secure that. We did get a land tenure, which is better than freehold. It's under the Lands Act now, it's a conservation part. And since then, Indigenous IPA, Indigenous Protected Areas, coming over that. And now Manigaubi Udinji are actually starting to build a wetlands facility on the site where Peter Hitchcock and I were looking to build a wetlands park. So I wanted to say also, it's a long process, but finally after 20 years, something is happening. And yes, Chelsea, eventually, I would hope that when the land is fully rehabilitated and we're getting more and more species coming into the area, that there might be a consideration of a Ramsar listing for the whole of the Cairns Basin.
And since the state government has recently promised to expand our protected areas in significant amounts, we would hope that would include some of the wetlands that we hold dear in this region. So we had another question over here.
Just a question for Rob. with the seagrass, what depth do the seagrass beds go to or survive off the North Queensland? And you're saying restoration, seeds or runners, are there any advantage with either of them?
Okay, so in the Great Barrier Reef, the seagrass goes down to about, I think our deepest depth is 76 metres. Deep. It's blue down there, 76 metres. And there's only a couple of species that make it down there. Holophilus spinulosa with its big leaves. It goes really dark as it tries to get enough light. It's not that uncommon to get seagrass that deep. When we do deep water surveys, we get about 30%, a bit over 30% of the drops will have some sort of seagrass in them, even in deep water. So it's actually a magic environment. We're not really sure what it does in terms of productivity, though. It may be very, very slow growing at that sort of depth. It's very hard to go and do any studies at 76 metres. You know, it requires a submarine effectively, or a camera and a very long rope and a lot of patience to drop a camera down to that depth. So it's quite difficult, and those areas aren't well studied. In terms of the seeds, and one of the things I should have mentioned in the talk is seagrass seeds aren't buoyant. They don't float. So if a seed drops off a plant, naturally, it's just going to stay local. It doesn't go anywhere. So the meadows are looking after themselves. In fact, the ecological advantage of dropping seeds where you are is that's a good place, and they form a seed bank in that location so that it's available. If you go to the literature, you'll notice that in places like Chesapeake Bay in America, they've done a lot of work with seeds, reseeding the seagrass there. And in fact, if you look at, I think seagrass and NASA, if you type that into the website, they've actually typed NOAA. Is it NOAA? Yeah, in the bottom with seagrass seeds, so the meadow's grown in the shape of the letters, and you can see it from space. I mean, the downside of that though is they don't have the same sort of species that we've got. They've got the Zostra marina, which produces enormous numbers of seeds, and they're quite easy to come by. Most of the seagrass seeds in North Queensland are pretty hard to come by. You can get them out of the mud. You can sit there with a sieve and sieve the mud if you like. But coming up with a lot of seeds is quite difficult. You can collect Zostra marina or Zostra capricornia off spathes. We've done that. But they're not the seeds around that you might want. The other thing about places like Chesapeake Bay is they have a huge tidal range of 20 centimetres. We don't have those things. We have 3 metre tidal ranges up to 6 metres. You can put the seeds in there, but I'm not sure where they're going to end up if you do it that way. So we've gone to planting actual plants and using there's a crocodile issue too. So we've done a little bit of replanting at Marillion, but you just can't get in the mud at Marillion. They won't let you anymore. The university is terrified about you being eaten while they're paying your salary for good reasons. So we've gone for one of those turf methods, and these are methods the Americans sort of developed in places like Boston, where you collect the seagrass and you tie it to a frame using taffeta paper or something that'll dissolve eventually, and then you can just drop that frame in the water and it'll hold those seagrass plants there for a while until the taffeta breaks down. You can lift the metal frame away, and that saves you. You can do that from a boat, and the advantage of that is you can get other people to do that for you. I mean, community members can use those sort of methods without risking their lives. And if you've ever been to those sort of mud flats like Cairns, you just can't walk on them anyway. You can't walk out on the Cairns mud flat easily. You could crawl out there, but no one's going to do that. So that's quite a good system of doing it. So we've been doing some work at Marillion looking at those techniques, but mechanically restoring a seagrass meadow by collecting plants, tying them to a frame and putting them out is not a fast business. It's a small scale cedar way of doing it. You start very small, hoping those things will then spread themselves. It's time consuming, hard work. You need to find a donor bed that you're not going to damage. You're not allowed to move things big distances in Queensland because of genetic problems. So it's not something that you're going to rush into. It's something that's going to need a fair bit of homework. It's very site specific.
We can't just put Lucy and her sister out there planting the mangroves anymore.
I thought the crocodile decoy actually.
She was small enough to sit on their shoulders. All right, so we have another question here.
Good day. Don't want to hog seagrass, but I'm interested the carbon soak up of seagrass. I imagine it soaks the dissolved carbon straight out of the ocean water. global warming, we've got higher carbon levels, so there's going to be more carbon available for more seagrass. How much nutrient do you need mud, or can you just plant it? Is there heaps of area that's available for seagrass where there isn't seagrass?
So let's just stay with the reef in North Queensland. No, most of the areas suitable for seagrass has some seagrass on it now. You could enhance that. It's quite complicated. If you go and put Osmocote out on a seagrass meadow, you'll get bright green seagrass. It tends to be nutrient limited in tropical waters because there may be a lot of nutrients out there, but they get absorbed in things like carbon sediments and they're not available to the plant. So there's a difference between what's out there in terms of nutrients and what the plant can actually mine out of it. So I'm not a blue carbon expert by any means, but I think it's around 15% of the total biomass ends up being incorporated back in the sediments as carbon. And like I said, it doesn't sound much, but it's a huge area. So you are getting a lot of carbon back in those sediments. But then it gets turned around a bit by bioturbation. There's worms and things turning it over. I'm really quite anxious about the blue carbon problem because, like I said, if banking on it means you've got to then do the other things. You've got to protect the environment to make sure you just don't get it back as carbon if it all gets washed away in a cyclone. And that's the lesson in the loss of mangroves in the Gulf, that the huge amount of carbon locked up in the mangroves just got very quickly put back into the system.
I think there's a lot of work to do in reducing our emissions as well as
so it's part of a package. Like I think that's what you have to look at, the absorbing carbon. You don't want to get into one of those cycles like you see the government doing where they plant trees in one place and clear trees in another. If you're going to use carbon, then it comes as a package and you need to look after it and you need to understand the limits of what you're doing. Short term. Yeah.
I'm going to jump in here to avoid getting into a conversational tone, which sometimes happens, and jump to the next question.
So on the note of mangroves sometimes being a bit scary and, mosquitoes, the crabs, the crocs, how can we reframe the public opinion of wetlands and mangroves and try and uplift their importance? Obviously conversations like this, but in curriculum and getting construction people to understand you can't just build right on the waterfront or whatever it may be. How can we uplift the profile of these hugely important ecosystems and just get the public to respect and love them more and connect with them?
Apparently I'm answering that one. I think that, in my experience and being at the airport and having access to the boardwalk for most of my time there, I think when people do go into those ecosystems and see that they aren't that scary, you can manage mosquitoes. It's not, the end of the world if you do get bitten, and you can manage that. And when they see how beautiful it is in there and how important it is, and even the mosquitoes have their part in that ecosystem. So I think helping people understand through experiences has been really effective. And everybody I've seen go down there, particularly into the southern arm of the boardwalk where the trees are really tall and the birds are everywhere. Nobody has been disappointed that I've seen who's gone down there. So I think having those immersive experiences is really important. And through taking amazing photos and doing things to show the wider public that it's not just a stinky mud flat, that there's a lot going on in there.
And also the National Environmental Scientific NESP, the thing. I can never remember acronyms, but NESP is actually about to fund some research. They've done research into framing these kind of things, and now they're doing research into reframing. So I think for a lot of our issues like mangroves, like crocodiles, like flying foxes, there's a lot of reframing opportunities that we can do, and I'd really encourage everyone to keep an eye on that. I think you wanted to say something to that as well, Dennis?
Look, with our mob, Russell River, the Wanya Yadinji people, we see the crocodile as a part of the whole system. Why I say that is that we go back with storylines, dance lines, etc., tied to the crocodile itself. So we see the crocodile as the apex predator or the apex predator in the whole system. To us, it's very, very important. We do a lot of work up the Russell River, and we see them every day. Every day. And we see some quite big fellas. Estimate around about 5+ meters. It's just like the freshwater. Freshwater, the apex predator in the freshwater is the jubbin. So what we do is we say to ourselves, we got to look after the jubbin. We got to look after the water quality. We've got to keep him happy because he keeps the balance in the freshwater. The same as what the crocodile does in the saltwater. And God forbid is that when they did a biomass study of the fish species in the Russell River, 51% were pest fish. It's like, tilapia dreaming land. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But they're the sort of things that, the challenges that we face.
Thanks, Dennis. And I think something that, came out of a couple of weeks ago, the Threatened Species Forum that happened here in Cairns, is learning more and more from the relationships that traditional owners have with land and sea as an opportunity to reframe how we relate to nature. And one of those opportunities to, explore different experiences with nature, and going into what Lucy said around immersion, more people going out on country and understanding that knowledge can help people understand a different way of relating to our natural systems.
Can I add just one final point to that? I think it was a well-articulated question. Thanks for that. Social media is huge, and I think, as a lecturer, embracing that more now, presenting content that can be uploaded into social media, it's hugely effective. And the message is getting out there, I think, more and more. I think there's a big generational shift now focusing on what I call science with purpose, science with solutions. So I think that's coming through really fast at us. And I guess the challenge is, are we ready for it?
Yeah, to put all those solutions on the ground. All right, another question.
Thank you. So we've heard quite a bit about credit trading schemes, both carbon, reef credit, soon to be biodiversity credits coming forward. Sorry. And I believe Lucy mentioned that there was the Emission Reduction Fund is now recognising reintroduction of tidal flow being a source or a way of accrediting blue carbon. But we've also heard that these systems are quite dynamic and that there can be changes over quite short timescales. I was wondering what people's thought on ongoing monitoring and the role of monitoring is in these kind of credit trading schemes going forward.
I'll start off. I don't think I have all the answers to that question. I get a bit nervous about removing bund walls as a solution for blue carbon. I think that puts the restoration service into one box. Our freshwater wetlands, we've lost them. There's so many we've lost. Bund walls are creating artificial, they're artificial, but they are freshwater habitats, provide the last remaining freshwater areas for turtles, for a lot of bird species. So I think there's a real risk if we just say there's a huge blue carbon opportunity by simply removing bund walls. I think we've missed that entirely. The role of monitoring, I mean, Mangala, the example I presented, is we've got about 8 years worth of data now, and it's only now that we've started to understand that system and the response of simply just removing a section of the bund wall. I think who knows what happens in the future, how climate change and tides react further, I suppose. So, I'm going to keep spending my own money, as Dennis said, and keep that monitoring going for as long as I can until we find some other funding bucket to keep that going.
Thanks for that. And I'm just going to see if there's any questions on Zoom. I'm speaking into the atmosphere now.
Well, hi there. I might actually relay a comment from the Zoom. This is on behalf of Melody, who says, here in the Philippines, particularly on the Agasan Marsh Wildlife Sanctuary, which is also a Ramsar site, the people and the government are still facing the dilemma between environmental protection and the expansion of agriculture. Because of this, the environmental degradation is still apparent, especially with the continued destruction of peatlands, which help sequester carbon dioxide.
Thank you for that. And are there any comments, questions as well?
There are, and I'll just relay a question.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay. Sorry, bear with me 1 second.
It's like hearing the voice.
Is anyone doing any work on the value of farm dams to wildlife, in particular birds? Historically, some councils kept these as part of the residential and other developments. However, today they've been filled in, even though in some cases they support hundreds or even thousands of birds and wildlife. For example, the shoreline development at Redland Bay, where a very large farm dam that has been there for decades, as well as smaller lagoon wetland dams very close to the shoreline. These are about to be filled in, and this question is from Kathy Clark from the Redlands BirdLife.
So does anyone have comment on that? Nathan's going to speak.
I'd actually pass this to Simon up the back there from BirdLife Australia. I think Simon's got an incredible knowledge and monitoring and view on this, I'm sure. So
I'm all about taking knowledge from the floor, so I'm making my way to Simon for this one.
It's Simon here from BirdLife. I think some work has been done on the value of farm dams, and the value of farm dams in different parts of Australia vary depending on the context of the wetlands that surround them. And certainly where there's been instances of regionally significant populations of particular species of birds now reliant on a dam or some other modified structure, BirdLife has actually listed some of those as being important. And it's recognising the fact that a lot of the surrounding wetlands may have been lost completely. So, yeah.
That's really great work, and often it is the community organisations in our areas that do recognise those important nuances in our wetlands. Are there any more questions from the sky?
Not at this point, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I might direct a question to Dennis and Liz because they've joined us here tonight, and some of us in the room might not know about the work that they're doing down there, but there's been some really incredible work understanding the soils around the area and restoring those waterways that you have. What do you think's been some of the key successes that you've had in the work that you've been doing with Darragon Eco Services?
I think the biggest success is actually with the landowners. Dennis mentioned our first project was a constructed wetland. It was only 10 hectares in size, so it was only quite small, particularly relative to the drainage area, which was all largely cane land. So it was never going to actually be big enough to improve water quality to the level that it needed to. But the important thing that came out of it is that it actually gave us an opportunity to start developing relationships with the broader farming community. And we've been operating in the catchment now since 2013. So again, not there for very long, but if there were a truckload of funding, there would be plenty of landowners lined up, prepared to actually undertake projects, whether they're environmental restoration or water quality improvement projects at the drop of a hat. And so I think that's the most critical lesson that we've learned. and it's taking the time to listen to what the landowners are saying, because they've been working the land for a very long time. And so they actually understand quite a lot of the natural processes, not always correct. We've tried to engage with a lot of the scientific community like Alex and Nathan to bring in their expertise to collect the data, trial different technologies and so on. And I think moving forward, we've now got quite a good understanding of the landscape in general and how the system operates, which is what Dennis was talking about with our catchment sustainability plan. And moving forward, it's actually developing the next level of detail that will be a significant enabler. An example of that is a current project that we're working with in partnership with the Department of Resources, and that's to do detailed soil maps across the catchment, or at least for about 15% of the in addition to a series of additional spatial maps that are used specifically for farm nutrient management. And for us, we see that it's not a single type of project that has to be implemented across the landscape. It's actually a multitude of strategies that we need to use and draw on depending upon what opportunities arise.
Thanks for that, Liz. Do you want to add anything, Dennis? Sorry, Dennis.
Just a one-liner. What it basically is it's an ecosystem approach. What it is basically an ecosystem approach. That means it doesn't look at one thing as being more important than another. It looks at everything and what the contribution is overall to water quality. That's what the plan is all about.
Thank you. And I'm actually going to take that moment because to maybe wrap us up. So we're finishing on time, and all of the contact details of our speakers are readily available on the internet. So I really encourage you, if you didn't get your answer tonight, to go to the information that was provided for this event and get in contact. But I think one of the big messages I'm taking away from tonight is about that interconnectivity, not just with how complex our natural wetlands are, but how complex our human environments are around it. We need to not only be looking at our carbon sequestration and those adaptation capabilities that wetlands have, but also what we need to do in our carbon environment to make sure that they're here for the years to come, and not compartmentalizing how we approach our wetlands conservation. We need to be looking at it at that landscape level and at that catchment level. And a comment that I heard from someone actually speaking about that he was speaking about working with cattle grazers to restore their waterways, and Liz tonight speaking about working with cane growers and other agriculturalists, said that the landscape of far north Queensland is changing again. And we have seen the landscape of far north Queensland change many times, from when we had tobacco farming ruling our agricultural system and going into our different types of agricultural and fruit farming and cane farming. I know that the restoration at the international level, at the national level, and at the local level is starting to get much more attention, because we don't need to just stop emitting carbon now. We need to start getting it back in the ground and back in the soil and back in the mud, and not so much in our oceans because it's getting very acidic there. So I certainly learned a lot tonight, and really thank all of the speakers for their time and coming together to help us celebrate our Ramsar wetlands, and for everyone who came along to listen. And I'm sure that in the break you got to share some of your knowledge as well. So for everyone up in the web, and out in the world who's listening, it sounds like from even as far as the Philippines, which is very exciting. Thank you for being here and celebrating us today. And let's hear one last round of applause for our speakers tonight. Thank you, everyone.